The gun barrel was still pointing at my son's chest when she noticed the badge clipped to his belt. Karen Morrison's face went from entitled rage to pure terror in the span of a heartbeat as she realized she'd just committed felony assault with a deadly weapon against the Riverside County Sheriff. The weapon trembled in her hands as my son calmly identified himself, and I watched 20 years of her neighborhood tyranny crumble in real time as backup units surrounded her perfectly manicured lawn. Let me tell you how the most dangerous woman in Meadowbrook Estates thought she could threaten my family with lethal force, and how her victim turned out to be the one person in the county with both the authority and the inclination to end her reign of terror permanently. It started 8 months ago when I moved into 1842 Pine Valley Drive, a quiet cul-de-sac in what the real estate agent described as an established community with strong property values and active neighborhood governance. The house was perfect for my retirement, modest ranch style with a decent yard, close to my grandchildren, and what I thought were normal suburban neighbors who minded their own business. Karen Morrison lived in the biggest house on the street, a sprawling colonial that dominated the neighborhood like a feudal castle overlooking peasant villages. She was the self-appointed empress of our HOA, a woman in her late 40s who treated community governance like her personal fiefdom. Everything about her screamed, "I peak in high school and never got over it," from her aggressively styled blonde hair to her designer workout clothes that had never seen actual exercise. Her husband Todd was a successful contractor who worked long hours and apparently dealt with his wife's behavior by avoiding home as much as possible. Their teenage daughter Emily was polite but clearly embarrassed by her mother's neighborhood antics. The family dynamic was obvious to anyone who paid attention. Karen ruled the household with the same iron fist she used on the HOA, and everyone else just tried to stay out of her way. The first warning sign came during my second week in the house. I was planting flowers in my front yard when Karen appeared on my lawn like a suburban storm cloud, clipboard in hand and wearing the kind of smile that suggested she was about to ruin my day. "Welcome to Pine Valley Drive," she said with fake sweetness. "I'm Karen Morrison, HOA President and Neighborhood Watch Coordinator. I need to discuss some concerns about your property compliance." I straightened up from my gardening, wiping dirt from my hands. "Concerns? I just moved in. What could possibly be wrong already?" She flipped through pages on her clipboard with theatrical importance. "Your mailbox doesn't meet HOA specifications for uniform community aesthetics. Your lawn needs professional treatment to match neighborhood standards. And these flowers you're planting aren't on the approved species list." I looked at my perfectly normal mailbox, my healthy green lawn, and my completely ordinary marigolds. "Are you serious? The HOA covenants are very specific about maintaining property values and community standards. I'll email you the compliance requirements. You have 30 days to bring everything into specification or face escalating fines." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing in my yard holding a handful of flowers that were apparently too dangerous for suburban democracy. That evening I received a 10-page email detailing dozens of rules about lawn care, landscaping, exterior maintenance, and community harmony standards that read like they'd been written by someone with serious control issues. Over the next few weeks, I learned that Karen Morrison had turned our neighborhood into her personal police state. She patrolled the streets daily, looking for violations and infractions that existed mostly in her own mind. She issued fines for grass that was slightly too long, decorations that weren't pre-approved, and parking violations that weren't actually violations according to county law. The woman was drunk on petty power and had convinced herself that her manufactured authority was real government. Neighbors whispered about her tactics but were too intimidated to fight back. She'd sued 3 families in the past 2 years over trivial HOA disputes, using her husband's contractor income to fund legal harassment that most people couldn't afford to fight. My own problems with Karen escalated when I installed a small American flag on my front porch. Not a huge display, just a standard 3x5 flag on a simple bracket next to my door. I thought it was respectful, patriotic, and completely uncontroversial. Karen thought differently. She appeared at my door the next morning with her clipboard and her fake smile, but this time there was genuine anger underneath the suburban pleasantries. "That flag needs to come down immediately," she announced without any greeting or explanation. "Excuse me?" Unauthorized flag displays violate HOA Covenant 15.7 regarding exterior decorations and political messaging. The flag comes down or you face immediate fines starting at $500. I stared at her in disbelief. "It's an American flag. On my own house. In America. The HOA doesn't allow political displays of any kind. Flags are considered political messaging and must be pre-approved by the Aesthetic Committee. Since when is the American flag considered political?" Her mask slipped slightly, revealing the authoritarian underneath. Since I decide what's political. The covenant language gives the HOA board broad discretion over community standards, and I've determined that unauthorized flag displays create divisive political atmosphere. That's when I realized I wasn't dealing with someone who had legitimate concerns about community standards. I was dealing with someone who got off on controlling other people and had found a legal framework to justify her power trips. The HOA wasn't about property values, it was about Karen Morrison's need to dominate her neighbors. The flag stays, I said calmly. Her expression turned venomous. Then you'll be hearing from our attorney. And I'll be documenting every other violation on your property until you learn to follow the rules like everyone else. She stalked away, but the threat was clear. Karen Morrison had declared war over a flag, and she intended to use every tool at her disposal to make my life miserable until I submitted to her authority. The harassment campaign began immediately. Karen walked past my house multiple times daily, taking photos of my lawn, my mailbox, my flower beds, my garbage cans, anything she could claim violated her made-up standards. She sent certified letters demanding I remove unauthorized plantings and threatening legal action for willful covenant violations. She reported my truck to the county for commercial vehicle parking in residential areas, even though it was clearly a personal pickup. She called code enforcement claiming I was running a business from home because I received Amazon packages. She even tried to get my utility services investigated for suspicious usage patterns that suggested illegal activities. The woman was using every government agency she could think of to harass me into submission, but she'd picked the wrong target. I'd spent 30 years in the military before retirement, and I didn't intimidate easily. More importantly, I had resources she didn't know about. My son Michael had followed me into public service, but he'd chosen law enforcement instead of the military. After 15 years working his way up through the sheriff's department, he'd been elected Riverside County Sheriff 3 years ago. He was well respected in the community, known for his fair enforcement of the law and his zero tolerance for people who abused authority to bully others. I didn't want to involve Michael in my neighborhood problems, but when Karen's harassment escalated to targeting my grandchildren, the situation changed. She'd started taking photos of my 7-year-old grandson playing in my backyard, claiming she was documenting noise violations and unsupervised minor activities. When she followed my daughter-in-law to the grocery store to continue her investigation, I decided it was time to bring in professional help. Michael listened to my story with the patience of someone who dealt with entitled suburbanites before, but I could see his jaw tightening as I described Karen's tactics. When I mentioned her photographing his son and following his wife, his expression went from professional interest to personal concern. "Dad, this woman is stalking and harassing your family. That's criminal behavior, not civil HOA disputes. I don't want special treatment because you're the sheriff. This isn't about special treatment. It's about criminal activity that needs law enforcement response. Taking photos of children and following people around isn't protected HOA activity, it's stalking." Michael's investigation into Karen Morrison revealed a pattern of escalating behavior that went far beyond overzealous HOA enforcement. She'd been reported for stalking and harassment by multiple neighbors over the years, but previous complaints had been handled as civil disputes rather than criminal matters. The sheriff's department had records of dozens of calls involving Karen Morrison, most dismissed as neighbor disputes by deputies who didn't understand the scope of her behavior. "She's been getting away with criminal activity by hiding behind HOA authority," Michael explained. "But stalking is stalking, harassment is harassment, and threats are threats regardless of whether someone claims HOA justification." The breaking point came 3 weeks later when Karen decided to escalate from harassment to intimidation. I was working in my garage when I heard shouting from my front yard. Through the window, I saw my son Michael's patrol car in my driveway and Karen Morrison marching across my lawn with something in her hand. Michael was in uniform, just finishing his shift and stopping by to check on me like he did a couple times a week. He was standing next to his patrol car, still wearing his duty belt and clearly identifiable as a law enforcement officer. Karen was approaching him aggressively, shouting about trespassing and unauthorized police presence in the neighborhood. I started walking toward the front yard, but Karen's behavior was escalating faster than I could move. She was screaming about illegal police harassment and demanding that Michael leave the neighborhood immediately. When he tried to explain that he was visiting his father, she became even more aggressive. "I don't care who you're visiting. This is private property and you have no authority here without a warrant. I'm ordering you to leave immediately or I'll file complaints for police misconduct." Michael remained calm, using the de-escalation training that had served him well throughout his career. "Ma'am, I'm off duty and visiting my father. I have every right to be on his property with his permission. Your father is a troublemaker who refuses to follow community standards. He's violated multiple HOA covenants and filed frivolous complaints to avoid accountability. I won't have police harassment in my neighborhood." That's when Karen made the decision that would destroy her life. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small pistol, pointing it directly at Michael's chest while screaming about her authority and her rights and her determination to protect the neighborhood from police intimidation. "I am the lawful authority in this community. I have the right to defend my neighborhood from police harassment. Leave immediately or face the consequences." The transformation in Michael was immediate and complete. One moment he was my son having a conversation with a difficult neighbor. The next moment he was Riverside County Sheriff responding to a direct threat with a deadly weapon. His hand moved to his service weapon while his voice shifted to the command tone that had made him one of the most effective law enforcement officers in the county. "Ma'am, drop the weapon immediately. You are threatening a law enforcement officer with a deadly weapon. Drop the gun now." But Karen was too far gone in her power fantasy to recognize the reality of her situation. She kept the gun pointed at Michael while continuing to scream about her authority and her rights and her determination to defend the neighborhood. She'd crossed the line from entitled neighbor to armed criminal in a matter of seconds. "I have the right to protect my community. I have the authority to remove threats. You will leave this neighborhood immediately." Michael drew his service weapon with the smooth precision of someone who'd trained for this situation hundreds of times. "Sheriff's Department. Drop your weapon immediately. This is your final warning." That's when Karen finally noticed the badge on Michael's belt and the sheriff's patches on his uniform. The realization hit her like cold water, and I watched her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and pure terror as she understood what she'd just done. She'd pointed a gun at the county sheriff. She'd threatened to shoot a law enforcement officer. She'd committed multiple felonies while screaming about her imaginary authority. The gun trembled in her hands as backup units began arriving, summoned automatically when an officer called in an armed threat. Within 3 minutes, my quiet cul-de-sac was swarming with patrol cars, deputies, and enough firepower to handle a small war. Karen Morrison, HOA president and neighborhood tyrant, was surrounded by law enforcement officers who were not impressed by her community authority or her property value concerns. She was facing multiple felony charges for threatening a peace officer with a deadly weapon, and her entire world was collapsing in real time. "Put the weapon down slowly and place your hands behind your head," Michael commanded, his training taking over completely. The personal element was gone. This was just another armed suspect who needed to be safely apprehended. Karen finally dropped the gun and began crying, the reality of her situation cutting through her delusions of authority. "I didn't know he was really a sheriff. I thought he was impersonating an officer. I was protecting the neighborhood." "Ma'am, you are under arrest for assault with a deadly weapon against a peace officer, making criminal threats, and unlawful possession of a firearm during commission of a felony. You have the right to remain silent." The handcuffs clicked shut around Karen Morrison's wrists as her neighbors watched from their windows and doorways. The woman who'd terrorized the entire street with fake authority was being arrested for real crimes with real consequences. Her HOA kingdom was ending in the back of a sheriff's patrol car. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Karen's criminal behavior. Her home office contained files on every neighbor, including photographs, personal information, financial records, and detailed surveillance notes that went far beyond anything legitimate HOA activity could justify. She'd been stalking residents for years, gathering information through illegal means, and using that information to harass and intimidate anyone who challenged her authority. The gun she'd pointed at Michael was unregistered and had been purchased illegally through a private sale that violated state background check requirements. She'd been carrying it for months while conducting her neighborhood patrols, essentially functioning as an armed vigilante who believed her HOA position gave her law enforcement authority. The district attorney's office treated Karen's case as seriously as any other assault on a law enforcement officer. The fact that she'd threatened the county sheriff with a deadly weapon while claiming governmental authority made her case a priority for prosecution. She was facing 25 years in state prison if convicted on all charges. Her attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal based on mental health issues and HOA authority confusion, but prosecutors weren't interested in lenient treatment for someone who'd committed armed assault against a peace officer. The evidence was overwhelming, the crime was serious, and the defendant had shown a pattern of escalating criminal behavior disguised as community service. The trial was a spectacle that dominated local news for weeks. Neighbors testified about years of harassment, stalking, and intimidation by someone who'd used HOA authority to justify criminal behavior. Law enforcement officers described how Karen's false reports and frivolous complaints had wasted hundreds of hours of police time and resources. Michael testified about the threat assessment and his response to an armed suspect who'd pointed a weapon at him while claiming governmental authority. His testimony was professional and factual, but the impact was devastating to Karen's defense. She'd threatened to kill a county sheriff while claiming the right to protect her neighborhood from police harassment. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Karen Morrison was sentenced to 15 years in state prison for armed assault on a peace officer, plus additional time for the weapons charges and stalking convictions. The judge's comments during sentencing reflected his view of defendants who abuse positions of trust to commit crimes. Mrs. Morrison, you systematically abused your position in the homeowners association to justify criminal behavior against your neighbors. When challenged by legitimate authority, you escalated to threatening a law enforcement officer with deadly force. Your actions demonstrate a fundamental disrespect for law and order that requires significant incarceration to protect the community. The neighborhood transformation after Karen's arrest was immediate and dramatic. Without her intimidation tactics, residents began talking to each other about the years of harassment they'd endured. New HOA leadership was elected within a month, focused on actual community maintenance rather than authoritarian control. The fake regulations that Karen had invented were eliminated. The surveillance and harassment stopped completely. The atmosphere of fear and intimidation that had dominated our street for years evaporated like morning fog. People started enjoying their homes again instead of living in fear of arbitrary enforcement actions. Todd Morrison divorced Karen while she was awaiting trial and moved away with their daughter, who was finally free from her mother's toxic influence. The house was sold to a quiet family who had no interest in dominating their neighbors. The entire Morrison legacy was erased from the neighborhood within 6 months. Michael continued his work as sheriff, but the incident with Karen Morrison became a training example for other law enforcement agencies dealing with HOA abuse cases. He developed protocols for investigating complaints involving homeowner association harassment and helped other counties recognize when civil disputes had escalated to criminal behavior. The case also prompted state legislation clarifying the limits of HOA authority and establishing penalties for association officers who abuse their positions to commit crimes. Karen Morrison's name became associated with laws designed to prevent other would-be tyrants from using community governance as cover for criminal activity. A year later, I still live in the same house with the same American flag on my front porch. The neighborhood is peaceful, the HOA functions normally, and nobody points guns at visiting sheriffs anymore. Karen Morrison serves her sentence in state prison, where her authority extends to whatever privileges she can earn through good behavior. The irony is perfect. A woman who spent years abusing fake authority learned about real authority when she threatened someone with actual governmental power. She wanted to control her neighborhood through intimidation and harassment, but she ended up controlled by the state prison system for the next 15 years. Sometimes justice is swift and decisive. Sometimes entitled people who think rules don't apply to them learn otherwise through the legal system they thought they could manipulate. Karen Morrison pointed a gun at my son, but she really shot herself in the foot with her own criminal behavior. The neighborhood is safer, the HOA is functional, and my flag still flies proudly on my front porch. Some lessons about authority and consequences are learned the hard way, but they tend to be permanent once the handcuffs click shut and the prison doors close. Property values have actually increased since Karen's removal, proving that the biggest threat to community standards was the person who claimed to be protecting them. Real authority doesn't need to threaten people with weapons. It just needs to be exercised properly when criminals reveal themselves through their own actions. Michael still stops by a couple times a week, but now he parks in the driveway without worrying about armed HOA presidents. The neighborhood kids wave at the sheriff's car instead of hiding from the neighborhood patrol. And somewhere in state prison, Karen Morrison has 15 years to think about the difference between legitimate authority and criminal intimidation. Justice served, community protected, and entitled authority permanently revoked. Sometimes the best way to deal with a neighborhood tyrant is to let them commit enough crimes to remove themselves from society. Karen Morrison thought she could threaten my family with lethal force, but she really just signed her own ticket to state prison.